Do you speak white? I'm sorry, can you get someone who speaks American? You came to live in Canada to speak English, right? Get on it. We've all been there, on hold for an hour with tech support, only to get some un-American respondent from some ridiculous un-American country with their offensive un-American accent. And then they have the audacity to tell you that their name is Jeff, Joe, Hank, Henry. I mean, like, I'm going to believe that, right? Because I know what you sound like, and you don't sound like John Smith, white 1.0 standard English for white people, and I can't have that interrupting my language ideals and my personal identity. Why? Because we did not conquer America from people who didn't know how to use it, only to be told how to fix our printers from people from shithole countries. That's right. America is ours. North, south, like I give a crap. America for Americans. Welcome to the second episode of Smashing the Heteronormative. I am your host, the anthropology student. Now, white people, I get it. You talk white, and you want everyone around you to talk white too, because it is the best language in the world, and it represents the land you committed genocide for. It's important to you. You have a right to people speaking white around you, don't you? Of course. We could talk about the 109 extinct indigenous languages in the Americas, from Canada, Greenland, Mexico, and the United States. It's true. Or we could talk about the approximately 300 spoken languages and pidgins that indigenous peoples of the North Americas have left. Or we could talk about the standardizations of language, a language that in itself is impossible to standardize, in that it stole from so many other languages, it cannot really be categorized. But really, let's talk about language policing and language aggressions. In your attempt to be white and speak white and impress your whiteness upon others through language, identity, and you are policing. You are saying that your English is better than those other Englishes. And then being better, you are superior and more white, and thereby more powerful than they are. A common example of this in the news in the last year was the caught footage of a man in a wheelchair physically assaulting a person because they were speaking Spanish to their mother in an airport. Whoop whoop, sound the alarm. Someone isn't speaking white. What does this even matter? Try to think of an experience you had as whatever speaker you are, and discovering that your language didn't have the power that you thought that it did, the power to communicate, the power to get your ideas across from one to the other. As a child, I remember being in an Indian household, and the grandmother didn't speak English. And so no matter what I did, no matter what I said, I couldn't get her to know what I wanted, what I needed. I couldn't express myself. I couldn't tell her that the reason I was crying was because I was upset, because she didn't know. I had to use an intermediary to speak for me. So I had to trust that somebody else would get what I wanted across, and that in turn I would get what I wanted, or what I needed, whatever. So I lost because I needed someone in the middle. And to, a 3-year-old, that could be so frustrating that you just give up. So I didn't get what I needed because I refused to ask for it, because I refused to let my ideas be translated through somebody else. And in doing so, I essentially gave up getting what I wanted. I didn't live there forever, obviously. But it's an interesting thing to try and think about when you're thinking about why people are speaking their other languages. When they came to Canada, white people. America, white people. Why are you speaking your non-white people language? Now, it's interesting the way that works in terms of going other places. So, like, when you go on vacation, like, people in the Americas love to tour Europe because it's so foreign and interesting. But we don't learn the languages to go there. When you go to Spain speaking white. And you go into Spain with your smile and your positive attitude. And you go, hey, no hablar Spanish? English? And they smile and they're, oh, you tried, that's so good. You did such a good job. Come here, come, I'll get you the things that you need to get. And they justify your whiteness with their language acceptance because you're money to them. So you become the tourist. You become the person that can now not be the language because you aren't the language. You are the white language. And with the white language comes the power. And with the power, you go to places like Spain and you speak English. And you're so proud when you come back from vacation and you learned how to ask for un cerveza, por favor, and you're just so proud of that moment. But then there are other places you go, places like Greece. You're not even going to try that language. That language isn't even English language. It's non-Romantic. It doesn't have A, B, C, D. Alpha, beta, gamma is not an acceptable language to be using when you're a white person. You need to use proper words with language and stuff. That's the only way to go. Now, as a student, I learned Spanish in university, and the strongest person and smartest person I would have to say that I met was a person that came from China, and in order to get their degree, they had a language requirement. That language requirement they fulfilled was Spanish. They learned Spanish through English as an intermediary. So they had to use their basis of their knowledge of English to translate things from their Chinese to English to the Spanish we were learning, and vice versa. So when they learned a word like hablar, which is to speak, they had to know that in English that meant to speak, so that they could translate that to their Chinese to say, you know, whatever that is in Chinese. And so they had to have those moments where they know what they were doing, but at times it could be so terribly frustrating to not know what you're doing. And at times when they got into the more advanced courses, they could skip right to. And so after getting over that initial groundwork, when they became fluent, they could then, with the professor, drop the intermediary and translate mentally between Chinese and Spanish and be able to get across that border with a lot less help, which is just amazing to me. Anyway, so everywhere you go in the world, colonialism put English there before you got there. So white people got there before you did to put white people there and to put the white language there. Now, let's bring this back home for a minute, though. In North America, I mentioned around 400 languages that are not English, but were here before English. So where are they? Well, I mean, of course, 109 were extinguished with the peoples that spoke them because of white people. Then the other around 300 aren't white, so we don't really need them, right? I mean, linguistic anthropologists are doing their best to document them and catalog them and, you know, put them in a nice binder on the wall that says, you know, this is the language, and I have it now, and it is a thing now, and I can analyze it, and I can use this. Is that enough? Is it enough to say that English is still the correct language in, you know, mind you, a country that's supposed to be bilingual, English, French, but, you know, still 300 languages. Or a country that is no official language, but yet English is still the language. So what's up with that? No official language? Why don't we have an official language? If we don't have an official language, why are all the signs in English? Couldn't I put up a sign in Portuguese? Because if there's no official language, then why do I have to put it up in English? Is it enough to say that English is still the correct language to be learning in the Americas, and that we are doing our best to restore and preserve the languages that we haven't lost yet? Is it doing our best to do it before any of these other languages die? In some cases, over the world, of all the languages that are spoken, there might only be exactly one human being alive that knows the language and has no other people to communicate with, and that language dies with that person. So to what extent can language learning not remain with the original languages of the land that we live on and be considered our best work, when we know that every day languages are getting less and less used, and languages are having less and less live speakers in them that are able to translate that, to have it cataloged, categorized, and put on the office wall as your achievement? Why do we need to put up such fronts around languages that aren't ours? Why do we feel that they push against our own identities? And why do we feel the need to physically push back? It doesn't make sense to me as to why I can come into a country that doesn't have an official language, but is just assumed to be English because the population is assumed to be white, and why I need to feel that my language is intimidating enough to be physically harmed by that. Anyway, that's all I have for this week. Feel free to join me next week as we talk about why do I have to agree with your gender identity, and why don't you have to prescribe to my idealisms. I will see you next week.